When did MTV first air?
Music television, MTV, made its debut August 1, 1981. When it was made available to 2.1 million cable-subscribing households in the United States. The format was all music, 24 hours a day. Audiences could tune in any time to watch popular rock artists performing hit songs. The notion of pairing music with video was not without precedent. The most obvious of which is the Beatles' 1964 critically acclaimed pseudo-documentary, A Hard Day's Night. What was new was the idea of airing music videos around the clock. MTV was the brainchild of John Lack, vice president of Warner Amex Satellite Entertainment, which owned the cable station Nickelodeon. He'd taken interest in the Nickelodeon program Pop Clips, a music and video show developed by Michael Nesmith, a former member of the pop group The Monkees. Lack thought the format had potential, and soon a young executive, Robert Pittman, just 27 years old, was given charge of the project. MTV was launched with 13 advertisers and a meager library of only 125 videos, all provided by the record labels. But MTV caught on, and by 1984 it had captured an audience of more than 24 million viewers, was showing a profit, and was soon spun off into a separate company by parent company Warner. The video colossus thrived during the 1980s, helping launch more than a few music careers. However, in the following decade VJs, video jockeys, had to make way for alternate programming on the music channel in order to keep audiences interested. In addition to the standard video programs, including theme shows such as Yo! MTV Raps, the cable channel broadened its offerings to include specials. MTV Spring Break and MTV Video Music Awards, as well as series such as Real World, Road Rules, and The Osbournes. All of the new programming was aimed at the Generation X audience, the very group of teens and 20-somethings who, in the 1990s, couldn't remember not watching MTV. Even though its audience was estimated to have declined by more than half since its peak, MTV remained a going and profitable concern into the 2000s. As advertisers continued to rely on the medium to reach the youth market.
What was the Bill of Rights of 1689?
The English Bill, accepted by King William III, 1650–1702. Who ruled jointly with his Protestant wife Queen Mary II, 1662–1694, seriously limited royal power. After a struggle between the Stuart kings and Parliament and the subsequent ousting of King James II, 1633–1701, Parliament presented the Bill of Rights to King William and Queen Mary as a condition of their accession. The document not only described certain civil and political rights and liberties as true, ancient, and indubitable, but it also ironed out how the throne would be succeeded. This point was of critical importance to the future of England. The article stipulated that no Roman Catholic would rule the country. Since the Bill of Rights served to assert the role of Parliament in the government of England, it is considered one of the seminal documents of British constitutional law.
Who was the first person in space?
The first person in space was Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, 1934 to 1968, who orbited the Earth in the spaceship Vostok 1, launched April 12. 1961. The flight lasted 1 hour and 48 minutes. The achievement made Gagarin an international hero. U.S. President John F. Kennedy. 1917 to 1963, announced later that year, on November 25, that the United States would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. The first step toward reaching that goal was made by putting the first American into space. On May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard Jr., 1923 to 1998, piloted the first U.S. space flight. Aboard the Freedom 7, the suborbital flight reached an altitude of 116.5 miles. Just more than 9 months later, the United States put a man into orbit. On February 20, 1962, astronaut John Glenn Jr. 1921, orbited Earth 3 times in the spaceship Friendship 7.
Why were Tsars Peter and Catherine known as the Great?
The epithet the Great can be misleading, while Romanov Tsars Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, and Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, are among the best known of the Romanov dynasty, and both had many accomplishments during their reigns. They are also known for having increased their power at the expense of others. Peter is recognized for introducing Western European civilization to Russia and for elevating Russia to the status of a great European power. But he also relied on the serfs, the peasants who were little more than indentured servants to the lords, not only to provide the bulk of the funding he needed to fight almost continuous wars, but for the manpower as well. Most soldiers were serfs. The man responsible for establishing schools, including the Academy of Sciences, reforming the calendar, and simplifying the alphabet also carried out ruthless reforms. Peter's most vainglorious act was, perhaps, to move the capital from Moscow to the city he had built for himself on the swampy land ceded by Sweden, St. Petersburg, known as Petrograd 1914-24, as Leningrad 1924-91. As his window on Europe, Peter succeeded in making the city into a brilliant cultural center. For her part, Catherine the Great may well be acknowledged as a patron of the arts and literature, one who corresponded with the likes of French writer Voltaire, 1694 to 1778, but she, too, increased the privileges of the nobility while making the lives of the serfs even more miserable. Her true colors were shown by how she ascended to power in the first place. In 1744 she married Peter III, who became Tsar of Russia in 1762. That same year, Catherine conspired with her husband's enemies to depose him. He was later killed. And so Catherine came to power, proclaiming herself Tsarina. She began her reign by attempting reforms, but a peasant uprising, 1773–74, and the French Revolution, which began in 1789, prompted her only to strengthen and protect her absolute authority. Like Peter the Great, she, too, extended the frontiers of the empire through a series of conquests. By the end of her reign, in 1796, Catherine had reduced even the free peasants to the level of serfdom.
Who was the first to write a modern novel?
While there are differing opinions on the answer to this question, it is generally accepted that the credit for the novel as we know it belongs to Spanish writer Miguel de Cervantes, 1547–1616. Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, in two parts, 1605 and 1615. It was the first extended prose narrative in European literature in which characters and events are depicted in what came to be called the modern realistic tradition. Considered an epic masterpiece, Don Quixote had an undeniable influence on early novelists, including English novelist and playwright Henry Fielding, who wrote the realistic novel Tom Jones, 1749. Don Quixote is also said to have anticipated later fictional masterpieces, including French novelist Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary, 1857, Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Idiot, 1868–69. And American writer Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, 1876, and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, 1884.
Why is Aristotle considered one of the greatest minds in Western history?
The system of philosophy that Aristotle, 384–322 B.C., developed became the foundation for European philosophy, theology, science, and literature. The Aristotelian system may be so much a part of the fabric of Western culture that the only effective way to describe his philosophy is through example. Among his writings on logic is organon, meaning tool or instrument. Here he defines the fundamental rules for making an argument. While other thinkers may well have formulated the argument before Aristotle, no one had made a systematic study of it. In Organon, Aristotle puts forth a method for coming to a conclusion based on circumstantial evidence and prior conclusions rather than on the basis of direct observation. This deductive scheme, called a syllogism, is made up of a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. For example, every virtue is laudable, major premise, courage is a virtue. Minor premise, therefore courage is laudable, conclusion. It is worth noting, however, that the belief in deductive logic was later rejected by English philosopher Sir Francis Bacon 1561–1626 in 1620, in favour of an inductive system, or one that is based on observation. In Poetics, Aristotle expounded upon his literary views. He maintained that epic and tragedy portray human beings as nobler than they truly are, while comedy portrays them as less noble than they are. In order to explain how tragedy speaks to the emotions of the spectator, Aristotle introduced the idea of catharsis. He separated tragedy from epic with the distinction that tragedy maintains unity of plot. Later translated as unity of plot, time, and place, while the epic does not. Because of the keen understanding evident in Poetics, the work has illuminated literary criticism since antiquity. In addition to logic and rhetoric, Aristotle wrote on natural science, physics, on the heavens, parts of animals, and on plants, and on ethics and politics, politics. His great philosophical work was Metaphysics, so named because, in the body of his works, it comes after, the Greek word for which is meta, the work physics. Metaphysics as a philosophy is the study of substance, or the nature and structure of reality. It is considered one of 5 major branches of Western philosophy. In modern thought, metaphysics can include many disciplines, such as cosmology, the study of the origins and structure of the universe, and theology, the study of religion. Most of the great philosopher's writings are compilations of notes from lectures he delivered to his students at the Lyceum, also called the Peripatetic School, in Athens. Among his pupils there were Greek leaders, including Alexander the Great, 356 to 323 BC.
Who invented the vaccine?
English physician Edward Jenner, 1749 to 1823, is credited with inventing the vaccine, however. Evidence suggests that vaccination, inoculation of a substance into the body for the purpose of producing active immunity against a disease, was used in China, India, and Persia, present-day Iran, in ancient times. In modern times, Jenner pioneered the science of immunology by developing a vaccination against smallpox. The English physician was practicing medicine in rural Gloucestershire in 1796 when he observed that dairymaids who had been sick with cowpox did not contract smallpox, suggesting that they had developed an immunity to the often fatal disease, which then occurred in epidemics. Jenner must have been quite certain of his theory. He chose to test it on an 8-year-old schoolboy, James Phipps, whom Jenner vaccinated with matter from cowpox vesicles from the hands of a milkmaid, Sarah Nelmes. Jenner then allowed the boy's system to develop the immunity he had previously observed in the dairymaids. Several weeks later, Jenner inoculated Phipps with smallpox, and the boy did not become even the least bit ill. The experiment was a success. Jenner continued his experiments for 2 years and then published his findings, officially announcing his discovery of vaccination in 1798. As Jenner suspected, vaccines provide immunity by causing the body to manufacture substances called antibodies, which fight a disease. Over the course of the 20th century, vaccination programs have greatly reduced disease, particularly in developed nations where childhood immunization programs are very effective. By 1977, vaccination had virtually wiped out smallpox.
Why does the Leaning Tower of Pisa lean?
The famous bell tower in Pisa, in northwestern Italy, leans because of the unstable soil on which it was built. Construction began in 1173 on the approximately 180-foot campanile. It began to lean as soon as the first 3 floors were completed. Nevertheless, building continued, and the 7-story structure was finished between 1360 and 1370. Leaning a bit more each year, by the time it was closed for repairs in 1990. The tower tilted 14.5 feet out of line when measured from the top story. Engineers on the project worked to stabilize the foundation and straighten it slightly, to prevent damage. The tower, which was built alongside a church and a baptistery, would probably not be remarkable if it were not for its slant. But with its characteristic angle, it continues to attract tourists to the small town on the Arno River.
When was the New York Stock Exchange founded?
The oldest and largest stock exchange in the United States, the New York Stock Exchange, NYSE, had its origins on May 17, 1792, when local brokers who had been buying and selling securities under a designated tree agreed to formalize their business transactions. The NYSE that most people would recognize today opened for business in 1825 at 11 Wall Street, New York City. At the time, most shares traded were in canal, turnpike, mining, and gaslight companies. Though a few industrial securities were first traded on the New York Stock Exchange as early as 1831. It was another 40 years before the complexion of trading changed to a more industrial nature. As the nation became increasingly manufacturing-oriented, the companies listed on the exchange reflected the economic shift. Today, if corporations wish to list their stocks on the NYSE, they must have a minimum of 2,000 shareholders. Each of those original shareholders must have 100 or more shares. The corporation must be able to issue at least 1 million shares of stock. And it must also provide a record of earnings for the previous 3-year period. The board of the stock exchange can make exceptions to these guidelines. Corporations may be listed with other stock exchanges, such as the American Stock Exchange. Or they may allow stock in their company to be traded as unlisted stocks, which are bought and sold in over-the-counter, OTC, trading. Companies that do not allow shares to be publicly traded are called private corporations.
What was the crisis in Darfur, Sudan?
The brutal violence, really a genocide, in Darfur began in February 2003 and was still ongoing 2 years later as United Nations, UN, negotiators tried to broker a peace agreement. Sudanese government troops and government-backed Arab militia, called the Janjaweed, were engaged in a violent campaign that targeted black African civilians from the Fur, Masalit, and Zaghawa ethnic groups in the western Sudanese state of Darfur, which is about the size of Texas. Reports from the Human Rights Watch and UN agencies working in Sudan indicated that large-scale bombing and burning campaigns had destroyed entire villages, tens of thousands of Darfurians had been raped and killed, and as many as 2 million had been displaced by early 2005. International relief efforts were hampered by ongoing violence, putting millions of women and children at risk of starvation and disease. Observers called for an international response to the crisis to avert another Rwanda. In April 2005, the UN Security Council referred the Darfur situation to the International Criminal Court. But to date, no one had been able to stop the campaign of ethnic cleansing. The Darfur crisis was part of a greater and older conflict in Sudan. The East African nation, whose neighbors include Egypt to the north and Ethiopia to the east, was in 2005 the scene of Africa's oldest civil war. The conflict had pit the Arab, Muslim, north against the Christian and animist south since 1984, but diplomatic efforts to resolve that decades-old conflict had so far failed in 2005. The Muslim regime based in the national capital of Khartoum was unwilling to share power and wealth. Thus, when Khartoum was hit with a rebellion in 2003, it retaliated by inciting the brutality in Darfur. Diplomats worked to resolve the North-South civil conflict, offering Sudan a package of debt relief and development aid that could reach $100 million. Critics of that plan said that incentives were not enough, and that sanctions should be levied against the nation to pressure the government to move toward ceasefire.
What were the Swedish colonial holdings?
The Swedish possessions consisted of a small colony called New Sweden, established in 1638 at Fort Christina, present-day Wilmington, Delaware. the Swedes gradually extended the settlement from the mouth of the Delaware Bay, south of Wilmington, northward along the Delaware River as far as present-day Trenton, New Jersey. The settlers were mostly fur traders, though there was farming in the colony as well. In 1655 the territory was taken by the Dutch in a military expedition led by Director-General of New Netherlands Peter Stuyvesant, c. 1610–1672. For 9 years the territory was part of the Dutch colonial claims called New Netherlands. In 1664 the English claimed it and the rest of New Netherlands. Delaware was set up as a British proprietary colony, which it remained until the outbreak of the American Revolution, 1775–83. New Sweden was the only Swedish colony in the Americas.
Why was James Joyce's Ulysses banned in the United States?
Irish writer James Joyce's, 1882–1941, masterpiece was originally published in 1922, it had been serialized prior to then. By the Paris bookstore Shakespeare and Company. By 1928 it was officially listed as obscene by the U.S. Customs Court. The reason was twofold. The use of four-letter words and the stream of consciousness narrative of one of the characters, revealing her innermost thoughts. When the official stance on the book was challenged in U.S. court in 1933, the judge, John Woolsey, called it a sincere and honest book. And after long reflection he ruled that it be openly admitted into the United States. Random House, the American publisher who had advocated the obscenity charge be challenged in court, promptly began typesetting the work in order to release a U.S. edition. But the court decision had important and lasting legal impact as well. It was a turning point in reducing government censorship. Prior to the case, laws that prohibited obscenity were not seen to be in conflict with the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which is most often interpreted as a guarantee of freedom of speech. And the U.S. Post Office and the Customs Service alike both had the power to determine obscenity. The government appealed the decision to the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. But Judge Woolsey's decision held.
What is contract bridge?
It's the game most people play when they play bridge. A card game for 4 players in 2 partnerships who bid to name the trump suit. The other kind of bridge is called auction bridge, which was invented in 1904 as a variation on the card game whist. Whist had been played since the early 16th century, if not longer. Auction bridge differs from contract bridge in that tricks made in excess of the contract are scored toward game. In contract bridge they are not. It's believed that contract bridge originated in 1926 when railroad heir and yachtsman Harold S. Vanderbilt, 1884–1970, invented the variation while on a Caribbean cruise. The game did not catch on until 1930, when Romanian-American contract bridge expert Eli Culbertson defeated Lieutenant Colonial W.T.M. Butler in a challenge match at London's Almack's Club. The match was highly publicized.
What are Nader's Raiders?
They were, and are, investigators working with American lawyer and consumer advocate Ralph Nader, 1934. With the help of his research team, Nader wrote the landmark work Unsafe at Any Speed in 1965. It charged that many automobiles weren't as safe as they should be or as consumers had the right to expect them to be. In part, the book was responsible for passage in 1966 of the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which set motor vehicle safety standards. Nader has continued his watchdog work, founding the Public Citizen Organization, which researches consumer products, promotes consumer awareness, and works to influence legislators to improve consumer safety. While Nader may be the most recognizable face of consumer advocacy, the movement's roots predate his activism. As the consumer age dawned at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, when mass production techniques came into wide use, some observers decried industry standards, or lack thereof, that put the public who used their products at risk. The muckraking journalists of the early 20th century disclosed harmful or careless practices of early industry, raising awareness and bringing about needed reforms. Upton Sinclair, 1878 to 1968, for example, penned the highly influential novel The Jungle, 1906, revealing scandalous conditions of meatpacking plants. The public was outraged upon reading Sinclair's work. President Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, ordered an investigation, finding the novelist's descriptions to be true to life. Government moved quickly to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act that same year, 1906. Industry watchdogs continued their work in the early decades of the century. In 1929, Consumers Research Inc. was founded, and in 1936, the Consumers Union was formed. Both of these independent organizations test and rate consumer products. Consumers Union publishes its reports in the monthly magazine Consumer Reports. Such consumer advocacy has served to heighten public awareness, compelling industry to make changes and improving the safety of products in general. Abuses still occur, but at roughly 100 years into the consumer age. The work of consumer watchdogs like Nader's Raiders has made the consumer experience far less risky than it once was.
When did department stores begin?
Department stores, which offer a wide variety of goods for sale in various departments, emerged in the mid-1800s. Many evolved out of general stores, which offered a variety of goods but not divided into departments, while others evolved out of dry goods stores, which sold textiles and related merchandise. The first bona fide department store was established in Paris, the Bon Marché, French meaning good bargain. Opened its doors in 1838. Between the 1850s and 1880s, numerous department stores opened in American cities including Jordan Marsh, founded 1851 in Boston, Massachusetts. R. H. Macy's, founded 1858 in New York City, the store was known for its creative advertisements. Wanamaker's, founded 1861 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It successfully implemented fixed pricing so that customers no longer haggled over price, and Marshall Field, founded 1881 in Chicago. Within 25 years it became the world's largest wholesale and retail dry goods store. These pioneer department stores, multi-storied enterprises located in downtown areas, introduced many innovations to merchandising, including the policy of returnable or exchangeable goods, ready-made apparel, clearly marked prices, and window displays. By the early 1900s, department stores could be found throughout the country. The timing was right for their emergence. Urban centers grew rapidly at the end of the century, giving department stores a ready clientele. The advent of the telephone, electric lighting, and billing machines helped retailers conduct business efficiently. Transportation improvements allowed for the shipment of large quantities of goods, and a variety of finished goods were mass-produced, increasing supply and lowering cost of production as well as the price to the consumer. By the 1910s, the stores were part of a new mass culture, which centered in American cities. During the 20th century, department store sales typically ranged between 6 and 12% of total annual retail sales.
When did the Napoleonic Wars begin and end?
The Napoleonic Wars began shortly after Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821, took power and lasted until 1815. When he was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Ever the general, Napoleon used his power to keep France at war throughout his reign. After the coup d'état of 18th Brumaire, November 1799, which had put Napoleon in power. At first he effected peace. In May 1800 he marched across the Alps to defeat the Austrians, ending the war with them that had begun 8 years earlier. Britain, fearing a growing European power on the continent, had declared war on France in 1793, by 1802, having grown tired of battle. The country agreed to peace with Napoleon in the Treaty of Amiens. But the calm in Europe was not to last. By 1803 the diminutive but power-hungry Napoleon, nicknamed the Little Corporal, had begun to plot an invasion of Britain. Declaring himself emperor in 1804, he initiated a series of campaigns across Europe. And by 1806 most of the continent was under his control. He remained, of course, unable to beat the British, whose superior navy gave them supremacy at sea. But the various alliances, called coalitions, formed by European countries against Napoleon eventually broke him. After he had been defeated in Russia in 1812, the European powers that had long been held in submission by Napoleon formed a sixth and final coalition against him: Great Britain, Russia, Sweden, Prussia, and Austria met Napoleon's army at the momentous Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, Poland. From October 16 to 19, 1813, Napoleon was defeated there in what is sometimes called the War of Liberation, and he retreated to France. The following March, the Allies making up the Sixth Coalition took Paris. Napoleon's generals were defeated. He abdicated the throne on April 6. However, that was not the end of the Napoleonic era. Exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba, Napoleon returned to Paris on March 20, 1815. Believing he could recover power in the unstable atmosphere that followed his abdication. 3 months later he was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. On June 18, it was the last battle of the Napoleonic Wars. He was exiled to St. Helena Island, where he died in 1821.
Did Henry Ford invent the automobile?
No, while Henry Ford, 1863 to 1947, transformed American industry and changed the way we travel, live, and work, he did not invent the automobile. Just before the turn of the century, there were several inventors who were tinkering with gas-powered vehicles. And by the time Ford had finished his first working car, the Duryea brothers, Charles, 1861 to 1938, Frank, 1869 to 1967, had demonstrated the first successful gas-powered car in the United States. An Ohio-born inventor, Ransom Eli Olds, 1864 to 1950, already had a car, the Oldsmobile, in production. Even prior to the work of these American inventors and entrepreneurs, Europeans had made strides in developing the automobile. The automobile is the result of a series of inventions, which began in 1769 when French military engineer Nicolas-Joseph Cugnot, 1725 to 1804, built a steam-powered road vehicle. In the early 1800s other inventors also experimented with this idea, and the steam-powered vehicle was put into production, both in Europe and the United States. In 1899 William McKinley, 1843 to 1901, became the first U.S. president to ride in a car, a Stanley steamer. Built by twin brothers Francis, 1849 to 1918, and Freeland, 1849 to 1940, Stanley. A breakthrough in developing gas-powered automobiles came in 1860, when an internal combustion engine was patented by Frenchman Etienne Lenoir, 1822 to 1900. But the car as we know it was born in 1885 when Germans Gottlieb Daimler, 1834-1900, and Carl Benz, 1844 to 1929, working independently of each other, developed the forerunners of the gas engines used today. In 1891 to 1892, French company Panhard et Levasseur designed a front-engine, rear-wheel drive automobile. This concept remained relatively unchanged for nearly 100 years. Until 1900, Europeans led the world in the development and production of automobiles. In 1896, the Duryea Motor Wagon Company turned out the United States' first production motor vehicle. The gas-powered cars were available for purchase that same year. The development of the car was helped by advances in rubber and in the development of pneumatic tires during the 19th century, with names like Charles Goodyear, American. 1800 to 60, John Boyd Dunlop, Scottish, 1840 to 1921, and the Michelin brothers, French. André, 1853 to 1931, and Edouard, 1859 to 1940, figuring prominently in automotive history. Even after the gas engine was invented, which was ultimately more efficient than the steam engine, the car's development continued along parallel tracks. About 1891, American William Morrison successfully developed an electric car. Electric cars were soon put into production, and by the turn of the century they accounted for just less than 40% of all American car sales.
What was the Chiapas uprising?
Also called the Zapatista Uprising. It was a January 1994 revolt staged by Mayan rebels in Chiapas, Mexico's southernmost state. On New Year's Day, members of the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, AZLN, launched a coordinated attack on 4 municipal capitals and a Mexican army headquarters in the remote region. With the cry of Tierra y Libertad, land and liberty, the armed insurgents invoked the name and spirit of Emiliano Zapata. 1879 to 1919, Mexico's early 20th century revolutionary leader. The EZLN, or Zapatistas, destroyed government offices, burned land deeds, and freed prisoners. At least 135 people died in the rebellion. On January 12, after 11 days of heavy fighting, a ceasefire was called. The next month peace talks began between EZLN representatives and the Mexican government. Negotiations between the two sides proved to be a frustrating and lengthy process. Seeking democracy, liberty, and justice for all Mexicans, the EZLN called for government reforms, including local autonomy, as well as land redistribution and other measures to aid the region's impoverished indigenous population. In February 1996, the two sides signed the San Andrés Accords and agreed to more talks. But in August of that year, the dialogue stalled. The EZLN said it would not return to the negotiating table until the government implemented the San Andrés Accords. Meanwhile, pro-government paramilitary groups with ties to Mexico's ruling PRI party, Institutional Revolutionary Party, made their presence known in Chiapas. There were violent episodes, the most horrific of which occurred on December 23, 1997, when the pro-government paramilitary group Paz y Justicia, Peace and Justice, brutally attacked a group of unarmed indigenous people in the village of Octeal. A total of 45 people, mostly women and children, were slaughtered, and 25 more were injured. The turbulence in Chiapas is fueled by deep-seated anti-government feelings among the indigenous, Mayan, population. Despite the fact that it is rich in natural resources, including coffee, corn, timber, and oil. It is one of the poorest regions of Latin America. The wealth of Chiapas rests in the hands of a few. In 1990, half of the population in the state was malnourished, 42% had no access to clean water. 33% was without electricity, and 62% did not have a grade school education. It was no coincidence that the 1994 uprising took place the same day that the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, went into effect, according to one Zapatista leader. NAFTA was the death sentence for Mexico's poor farmers, who would now have to compete with farmers north of the border. In 2005, more than 10 years after the Zapatistas burst onto the scene, the situation in Chiapas remained unresolved.
Why was Alger Hiss tried?
U.S. public official Alger Hiss, 1904 to 1996, was tried for perjury during 1949 and 1950. His first trial ended in a hung jury, and the second trial concluded with a guilty verdict and a sentence of 5 years in prison. Hiss served 4 years and 8 months before he was released and returned to private life. To this day, many believe Hiss was framed by Republican politicians who charged President Harry Truman's 1884 to 1972 administration with employing communists who acted as secret agents for the Soviet Union. The politically charged case was packed with intrigue, including the testimony of a Time magazine senior editor who was later revealed to be a perjurer and who used at least 7 different aliases in a 14-year period. Microfilm evidence stored in a hollowed-out pumpkin in the middle of a farm field, and an old typewriter, which later evidence and testimony revealed was probably a fake. The case against Hiss was made amidst the investigation of un-American activities of the House of Representatives. It was 1948 and the Cold War was on, distrust was running high. And when a man named Whittaker Chambers, an editor at Time, appeared before the House committee and claimed that Hiss had been a courier who had transported confidential government documents to the Soviets. Hiss, then president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, became the subject of investigation. He was indicted and stood trial, in spite of his distinguished career as a public servant. He had served in the State Department for 11 years. A parade of character witnesses who testified of his integrity, loyalty, and veracity, and his own vehement denial of the charges. The prosecution managed to bring enough evidence against him to convince a second jury that Hiss lied when he said the charges that he was a secret agent were a complete fabrication. The jury in Hiss's first trial deadlocked following more than 14 hours of deliberation. Even after his conviction, Hiss's lawyers worked tirelessly to appeal the case. All attempts were denied. In 1957 Hiss published his own account of the case. In the court of public opinion, in which he reasserted his innocence. Then in 1973, during the Watergate hearings, former White House counsel John Dean's 1938, explosive testimony included the statement that he heard President Richard Nixon 1913 to 1994, say, "The typewriters are always the key, we built one in the Hiss case." In 1988 Hiss published again. The book was titled Recollections of a Life. 4 years later, at the age of 87, Hiss appealed to the Russian government to examine their intelligence archives to see what they revealed about him. The response came back that there was not a single document substantiating the allegations that Hiss had collaborated with the Soviet Union's intelligence service. That same year, 1992, Hiss's son, Tony, wrote an article for the New Yorker magazine. It was titled "My Father's Honor."
How did the birth control movement get started?
The decline in death rates, which has meant an overall increase in the world population, gave rise to the birth control movement. Scientific advances during the 18th and 19th centuries resulted in better food supplies, the control of diseases, and safer work environments for those living in developed countries. These improvements combined with progress in medicine to save and prolong human lives. During the 1800s, the birth rate, which in earlier times had been offset by the death rate, became a concern to many who worried that population growth would outstrip the planet's ability to provide adequate resources to sustain life. In 1798 British economist and sociologist Thomas Robert Malthus, 1766–1834, published his essay on the principle of population, arguing that populations tend to increase faster than do food supplies. He thereby concluded that poverty and suffering are unavoidable. Malthus viewed only war, famine, disease, and moral restraint as checks on population growth. In spite of or because of Malthus's assertions, during the 1800s the idea of birth control as a practical method to keep population growth in check gained momentum. Early in the 1900s the movement found a leader in American Margaret Higgins Sanger, 1883–1966, whose personal experience as a nurse working among the poor had convinced her that limiting family size is necessary for social progress. She became convinced that unwanted pregnancy should be avoided by using birth control methods. It was and remains controversial. Even though the distribution of birth Control information was illegal at the time, Sanger advised people on the subject. In 1914 she founded a magazine called The Woman Rebel, and she sent birth control information through the mail. She was arrested and indicted. But she was not deterred. In 1916 in Brooklyn, New York, Sanger founded the first birth control clinic in the United States. In 1921 she organized the first American birth control conference, held in New York. That same year she founded the American Birth Control League, which later became the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. As public support for the movement increased, Sanger succeeded in getting laws passed that allowed doctors to disseminate birth control information to their patients. In other countries, Sanger's work inspired similar movements. But developed nations continue to have lower birth rates than do developing nations. With the world population exceeding 5.5 billion. The fear of overpopulation had prompted new interest in birth control.
What caused the Spanish Civil War?
From 1936 to 1939, two sides fought for control of Spain, the Nationalists and the Loyalists. The insurgent Nationalists were aristocrats, military leaders, Roman Catholic clergy, and members of a political group called the Phalange Party. They were supported by Nazi Germany, under Adolf Hitler 1889 to 1945. And Fascist Italy, under Benito Mussolini 1883 to 1945, in their effort to wrest control. The Loyalists were liberals, socialists, and communists. They were supported by the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin 1879 to 1953. A number of non-Spanish idealists, who believed saving the Republic from the fascist rebels was worth dying for, joined the ranks of the Loyalists to form the International Brigade. In his novel For Whom the Bell Tolls, Ernest Hemingway 1899 to 1961, who had covered the war as a correspondent, wrote about one young American man who took up arms in behalf of the Loyalist effort. The Nationalists, under Generalissimo Francisco Franco, 1892 to 1975, won the war when they captured Madrid in March 1939, beginning an era of harsh right-wing rule. And, as with any war, the fascist victory had come at a dear price. Hundreds of thousands dead and massive destruction throughout the country.
Why was Julius Caesar murdered?
The Roman general and statesman Julius Caesar, 100 to 44 B.C., was stabbed to death in the Senate House by a group of men, including some of his former friends, who viewed him as an ambitious tyrant and a threat to the Roman Republic. The date of the assassination, March 15, fell into relatively common usage thanks to William Shakespeare's tragedy. Julius Caesar, written in the late 1590s, which has a soothsayer warning the Roman general to beware the Ides of March. After Caesar's death in 44 BC. A triumvirate was formed to rule Rome, with Lepidus, Octavian, who would in 27 BC become Augustus, the Roman Empire's first ruler, and Mark Antony sharing power. It was Mark Antony, c. 83 to 30 BC. Of Antony and Cleopatra of fame, who aroused the mobs against Caesar's conspirators, driving them out of Rome. The events illustrate the controversy about Julius Caesar. While some clearly viewed him as a demagogue who forced his way into power, others considered the patrician-born Caesar a man of noble character who defended the rights of the people in an oligarchic state where the government was controlled by a few people who had only their own interests in mind. This divided opinion has followed Caesar throughout history. While opinion is still divided on what kind of a ruler Caesar was, there can be no denying his contributions both to Rome, which would soon emerge as the Roman Empire, and to modern civilization. In his battles, Caesar brought the provinces of Italy under control and defeated his former co-ruler, Pompey the Great, who had, along with Caesar and Crassus, formed the first triumvirate, effectively ending the oligarchy that had ruled Rome. In so doing, he had succeeded in ending the disorder that had plagued Rome for decades and laid the groundwork for the formation of the empire under his grandnephew Augustus in 27 BC. While Caesar was in office, he planned and carried out several reforms, not the least of which was the implementation of the Julian calendar, which he introduced in 46 BC. The Gregorian calendar we use today evolved from it. Caesar also left a legacy of literature. He penned a total of 10 books on his battles in Gaul, c. 58 to 50 BC, and on the Civil War, which he had more or less started in 49 BC. These clear commentaries are still considered masterpieces of military history.
Why was Socrates condemned to death?
Socrates, c. 470 to 399 BC, the Greek philosopher who is credited, along with philosophers Plato, c. 428 to 347 BC, and Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, for laying the foundations of Western thought, had many followers in his own time. However, his ideas and methods were controversial, too, which led him to be tried before judges and sentenced to death, which he carried out by drinking hemlock, poison. He had been charged for not worshipping the Athenian gods and for corrupting the young.
What rights are protected in the Bill of Rights?
The first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution are collectively called the Bill of Rights, which became law on December 15, 1791, and are meant to guarantee individual liberties. The First Amendment, which is perhaps most often cited by Americans, Guarantees freedom of religion, speech, and the press, as well as the right to assemble peaceably and the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear arms, stating that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The Third Amendment forbids peacetime quartering of soldiers in private dwellings without consent of the owner. The Fourth Amendment forbids unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth through the Seventh Amendments establish basic standards of jurisprudence. The Fifth, which long ago fell into common usage with the phrase, "he's pleading the Fifth," guarantees that a person will not be compelled to testify against himself. The amendment also ensures that a criminal indictment can only be handed down by a grand jury. 12 to 23 people who determine if a trial is necessary. And prohibits double jeopardy, being prosecuted twice for the same criminal offense. The Sixth Amendment protects the rights of accused persons in criminal cases by guaranteeing a speedy and fair trial, an impartial jury, and the right to counsel. The Seventh Amendment guarantees trial by jury. The Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail, excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment, which is one that many Americans are probably unable to cite, is an important one nevertheless. It states that simply because a right is not enumerated in the Constitution, it does not mean that the people do not retain that right. The 10th Amendment relinquishes to the state governments those powers the Constitution did not expressly grant the federal government or deny the states. In other words, it limits the power of the federal government to that which is granted in the Constitution.
Who are the members of the United Nations Security Council?
According to the UN Charter, the Security Council has 15 members. 5 permanent and 10 that are elected by the General Assembly for 2-year terms. The permanent members are China, France, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The 10 temporary slots are elected annually, 5 nations at a time. So that on January 1, 2004, the following nations began 2-year memberships: Algeria, Benin, Brazil, the Philippines, and Romania. On January 1, 2005, Argentina, Denmark, Greece, Japan, and the United Republic of Tanzania began 2-year memberships. In 2005, Japan, Germany, India, and Brazil made bids for permanent seats on the Council.
How did World War I end?
Though the United States had been little prepared to enter the war, the American government mobilized quickly to rally the troops and the citizens behind the war effort. In April 1917, the U.S. regular army was comprised of just more than 100,000 men. By the end of the war, The American armed forces stood some 5 million strong. It was the arrival of the U.S. troops that gave the Allies the manpower they needed to win the war. After continued fighting in the trenches of Europe, which had left almost 10 million dead. In November 1918, Germany agreed to an armistice and the Central Powers finally surrendered. In January 1919, Allied representatives gathered in Paris to draw up the peace settlement.
Why was Susan B. Anthony tried?
Susan B. Anthony, 1820 to 1896, was tried for violating federal voting laws. The suffrage movement was in full swing in 1872 when Anthony and 14 female companions went to the Rochester, New York, voter registration office and demanded to be registered. When the officials refused, Anthony argued with them, showing them the written opinion of a Judge Henry R. Selden, who agreed with her, and others, that the 14th Amendment 1868 also protects women's rights, including the right to vote. She threatened the registrars that she would sue them if they did not allow her to participate in elections. They gave in and the women signed up to vote. On election day, November 5, they did just that. 23 days later, all 15 women were arrested for having done so. Bail was set, and eventually all the women were released. The following June, Anthony's trial got underway. The U.S. District Attorney presented the government's case against her. She had upon the 5th day of November 1872, voted. At which time she was a woman. She was found guilty and ordered to pay a fine of $100. In another act of civil disobedience, Anthony refused to pay it, saying, "Resistance to tyranny is obedience to God." In the coming years, the nation's courts continued to narrowly interpret the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, to the exclusion of women. Anthony died 24 years before American women were granted suffrage. After the 19th Amendment was made in 1920.
When did mobile phones first come into use?
Mobile communication dates back to radio phones used in the 1940s and 1950s. They were two-way radio systems that were powered by car batteries and required operator assistance. They were not very reliable, and the phones were anchored to a place, not a person. The first truly mobile phone call, in that it used a portable handset, was manufactured on April 3, 1973. The caller was Dr. Martin Cooper of Motorola, who, from the streets of Manhattan, called rival researcher Joel Engel at Bell Laboratories. At NT's research arm, the two companies were in a heated race to develop mobile telephony. The device used by Cooper that day was called the Dynatac. It weighed 2 pounds and had simple dial, talk, and listen features. The first generation of mobile phones began to be widely used in the 1980s. These phones were large by today's standards and were usually installed in a car or briefcase. Transmission was via clusters of base stations, or cellular networks. The next generation of mobile phones appeared in the 1990s. The handset and battery technology improved, allowing for more features in smaller-sized phones and greater mobility. These were reliable phones that people could carry with them. As more users adopted the technology, cellular providers expanded transmitting systems. In some areas of the world, usage took off to the point of near universality by 2000. Usage in the United States, though strong, lagged behind the rest of the developed world. Some analysts believed that this was due to relatively high service fees, while others cited a lack of reliability, especially in rural areas. The land-based telephone system in the United States was designed to 9 nines of reliability, meaning it can be counted on to function 99.9999999% of the time. A standard as yet unmet by cellular technology.
How were Europe's lines redrawn as a result of World War I?
The treaties that came out of the Paris Peace Conference. 1919-20, redrew Europe's boundaries, carving new nations out of the defeated powers. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to give up territory to Belgium. Czechoslovakia, Denmark, France, and Poland. Germany also forfeited all of its overseas colonies and turned over coal fields to France for the next 15 years. The treaties of Saint-Germain and Trianon toppled the former Empire of Austria-Hungary, whose Archduke had been assassinated in 1914, triggering the war. So that the separate nations of Austria and Hungary were formed, each occupying less than a third of their former area. Their former territory was divided among Italy, Romania, and the countries newly recognized by the treaties: Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the kingdom that later became Yugoslavia. The Treaty of Sèvres took Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, Palestine, and Syria away from the Ottoman Empire, which 3 years later became the Republic of Turkey. Finally, Bulgaria lost territory to Greece and Romania. However, these new borders would serve to heighten tensions between some countries, as the territorial claims of the newly redrawn nations overlapped with each other.